Bus.
Hey everybody, thank you for joining me on episode 131 of The Virtual Couch. I'm your host, Tony Overbay, licensed marriage and family therapist, certified mindful habit coach, writer, speaker, husband, father of four, ultramarathon runner, and creator of The Path Back, an online pornography addiction recovery program that is helping people put their lives in order, put pornography behind them once and for all. And if you or anyone that you know is struggling to put pornography in their rearview mirror or any type of compulsive sexual behavior, even if they don't think that it's a problem, point them over to pathbackrecovery.com. There you'll find a short ebook that describes 5 common mistakes that people make when trying to put pornography behind them. Again, that's pathbackrecovery.com. So I'm trying a little something new. This is something that I've wanted to do for a long time, and that is just kind of talk off the cuff about something that I have done a lot of work around, maybe something I'm a little bit passionate about, and that is the whole topic of pornography. Is it an addiction? Is it not an addiction? Does it matter if we call it an addiction? Is it a little bit good? Is it not good at all? What does the data say? Is this just like a bunch of, is it a witch hunt? All things about pornography addiction, compulsive sexual behavior, that sort of thing. And I've gotten, I get questions, I can almost say literally every day about people who struggle with addiction, pornography, that sort of thing. And so the reason why I said I've always wanted to do this is I've written them down, I've got answers, but a lot of times I just want to kind of speak again off the cuff and just talk about the things that I see in my practice. And just what the research says, and just practical applications of how to put these things behind you. And to be fair, I just haven't done it. And I was presented with it's a program, a software program. It's a new podcast recording program, and it kind of puts all these things together for you. So quite frankly, I thought this was the perfect opportunity to give this a try. So this program that I'm using, you record in bits. I just recorded my intro, then I hit stop. This is, I think this is called the opener. Then I'm going to get to the main, and it's going to produce and put all these things together and normalize the sound and put music behind it. So I'm just kind of curious what the production content's going to be like. So I thought this would be a good thing to kind of test this whole new building platform on. So this podcast might never see the light of day. It might be just some sort of bonus episode. But with that said, let me get to the content. So on to the opener. Okay, so one of the things that I thought that I would do is almost kind of take you through if someone first comes into my office and someone's coming in for pornography addiction. And I get people in a lot of different states when they come in. Sometimes people have been caught by a spouse, or if it's a teenager, by their parent, or sometimes it's somebody that just feels like once and for all they maybe confess to a religious leader, or they just have always felt like, okay, one more time, this is the last time that I'm going to look, I'm going to stop, I need to stop. This isn't helping my relationship. It's wasting time. It's wasting money. And so this is it. So I got to do something. I got to get help. And so I get people in a variety of, when they come into my office, in a variety of stages or states of mind. And I'm often asked, does that matter? And to be fair, I do think it matters. It matters a little bit in the sense that here comes, I almost want to keep track of the amount of cliches I'll probably use in trying to talk about this today. But the person has to want to get help. And because if they're coming in and they don't even think that they have a problem, and they don't really think it's a big deal, they're coming in as a checkbox item because their spouse told them that they needed to, or their parent needed to tell them to, then I'm not going to kick them out, but they do need to have a desire. And sometimes people come in and they even say, look, I don't turn to pornography very often. I've got a whole lot of, I can put a lot of distance between times where, and I'll just use the word relapse. And so I really don't think it's a problem. But then there are other people that say that's the problem, is that I get a whole lot of time between a relapse. I think that it's never going to happen again. And then before I know it, I kind of find myself right down that rabbit hole, and I'm now acting out. And then here comes that tremendous amount of guilt, shame, that sort of thing. So there's a couple of things that I like to start with when somebody comes in to see me for a session. One of those is that the quicker that somebody can feel comfortable and really open up and tell me what their experience is like, the better. And I understand that addiction in general it's something that drives isolation. So here's something where when somebody maybe has opened up to a spouse or a religious leader, they're typically met with shame. And even from a well-meaning partner, even from a well-meaning religious leader who might say, oh man, I appreciate you coming in, but you realize this is pretty bad stuff. I mean, we really got to put this behind them. And the hard part is that person has thought hundreds of times, if not thousands of times, that they know that this isn't something that they feel good about or something that they want to continue to do, or they, so when somebody just comes in and says, you realize this is pretty bad, right? Then the person kind of immediately feels that shame. So they've kind of opened up their heart. They're being a little bit more vulnerable. They come in and they're finally going to do something about this. And then they're met with the, oh boy, yeah, this is pretty bad. And so I want to kind of say, even what I'm kind of talking today, I'm being a little bit more open. I recognize that when I have a couple in my office that this is difficult because I need to build strength or rapport with the person. We'll just call them the addict for now. And but I also understand that the spouse, oftentimes they've been hurt. I mean, that's that whole concept of betrayal trauma. The symptoms of betrayal trauma mimic those of, or not mimic, they are the same type of symptoms as those from PTSD, where there are these triggers. The spouse is trying to make sense of the entire relationship. They feel like they've maybe been lied to or duped about everything, and don't necessarily see or recognize that the addiction can be just this thing that the person compartmentalizes, or this thing that the person brings out when they feel bad about themselves, or when they feel like this void, or they feel like they just need to kind of check out, or it's really a coping mechanism, and that when they are not in acting out, that they desperately want the relationship, but at some point they start to feel this guilt or shame about doing the act, which then makes them withdraw from the relationship. So it's just this vicious cycle. So I want to acknowledge that it does feel a little bit different whether I'm working with an individual or when I'm working with a couple. So I'm going to take today's approach as when I'm working with an individual. So the first thing I like to do is, I am thankful that the person has come into my office, and it helps if they are the ones that say, all right, I want to do something about this. But even if they're not, I look at this as, I can do what we call in the therapy world psychoeducational work. I can let them know. I can even let them know that here's what life can look like without pornography in your life at all. And, kind of turn to the data, turn to the evidence around that. Because there's enough there now that is pretty clear that this isn't just a religious issue where people who are, maybe pro-Christian or pro-church say it's a bad thing, and people that aren't say it's fine. There's data now, enough data that kind of coming from the world of divorce that shows that there was a pornography component in over half of all divorces, I think, that I was reading. That was a couple of years ago, so I can only imagine that that's probably on the rise. And I've been doing this long enough that I can still remember when we used to say to parents, it's not a matter of if your kids see it, but when. I remember pretty clearly when that transition occurred. So back to when I have someone in my office, the first thing I want to do is just tell them thank you. And I appreciate just even having this opportunity to talk. And I want them to understand that this is going to be a little bit of a process. I'm often asked, how long does it take? If somebody comes in and they really do want to put this behind them once and for all, what are we looking at? A few months, a few years. And I've worked with a couple of people that are, I guess I don't even want to know if I bring them up, because but there's some data around that shows that really putting this behind them once and for all, it can be a 2 to 3 year process. And so I don't know, sometimes people hear that and they think, okay, that's okay, because I got time, I don't have to be perfect tomorrow. But then other people hear that and they think, oh my gosh, that almost causes more stress than they even anticipated. And so that's one of those things that I don't just jump out and say, hey, thanks for coming in there, champ. You're going to get to know me a lot over the next 2 to 3 years as you try to put this behind you. And because sometimes that's not what the client needs. So every client, and here comes a bunch of those things that I love to talk about in other podcasts. Every client comes to the table with their own, what we call private experiences in the world of acceptance and commitment therapy, my modality of choice. What that means is some people are going to hear 2 to 3 years, and based on what they've been through, based on their nature, their nurture, their DNA, their upbringing, their attachment issues, their abandonment, if people have maybe died in their lives, if there's been friendships that have disappeared, if they've moved a lot, whatever their experience is, they're going to hear 2 to 3 years, and it's going to mean something different to the person beside them that hears 2 to 3 years. So again, just knowing that hey, it can take time. For some, they can feel like, okay, good, I don't have to have this figured out tomorrow. and for others it can feel a little bit daunting. But then one of the other things I like to do is, and if we're taking this from a religious standpoint, from a view of Christianity, and if we aren't, I mean, still kind of the next part that I'd like to say is fairly similar. If you go from the Christian point of view, it's, hey, God made man and woman, put us on the earth, and said, replenish, go forth and replenish the earth. So the fact that we have sexual needs, sexual desires, not a bad thing. And so, I used to have this line where I would say, I would rather work with the person who is trying to curb that appetite than the person who has absolutely no sexual desires or appetite. But then I realized that can sound pretty insensitive to somebody if they don't have any type of kind of sexual drive or appetite as maybe one of their factory settings. Somebody maybe who feels like they're more asexual. But my only point by that is I'm trying to let somebody know. It's starting to kind of spread the word of, hey, the shame part is not really helping us out. So when somebody feels like, what's wrong with me? Well, nothing. You're a human. You're attracted to someone else. You're attracted to, depending on your sexual orientation, you're attracted to the same sex, you're attracted to opposite sex, but there is a natural attraction that is built in. So again, whether we go from a religious standpoint, that's one of those things where it's like, all right, it's who you are. And so let's go ahead and start getting rid of the shame right there. If you come from a purely biological evolutionary standpoint, then this desire in us comes from the need to want to procreate, to express our dominance, to our tribe, to spread our seed, all those kind of things. So the first thing I try to do is get rid of the shame. One of the other things that I like to talk about early on is a lot of times people have come to me, and I'm not the first person they've come to try to overcome this problem. And so I still remember the person who was in my office where I just said, hey, are you like expecting me to have this top secret thing that when I tell you the secret word or handshake or pill or chant or spell, that when I give it to you, then you will finally be able to put the pornography part behind you once and for all? Because if that's the case, then man, I apologize. Because if I had that thing, I'd be figuring out a better way to sell that magic word or handshake or whatever, to help others and to kind of capitalize this world of addiction recovery. But I don't. So, but here's the thing though, is that I feel like one of the keys to overcoming any kind of addiction, especially pornography addiction, is people come and they come to a therapist or they come to a leader, they turn to their spouse and they basically say, okay, I'm gonna try. And then here's again the hard part. If I'm working with a couple versus working with an individual, if I'm working with an individual, I'm going to try, but there's a pretty good chance that relapse may be inevitable. And so when the person starts doing the work with the therapist, and then if relapse occurs, we got a couple of things that happen there. One is that the person might be now ashamed to tell their therapist because they're thinking, I'm coming in there now, I'm paying money, and I'm not able to overcome this. So they either one thing, they'll disappear, they stop making appointments, or the other, they lie to their therapist. They come in and like, you know what? No, I'm doing pretty good. And the hard part is, having done this now 15 years or so, 1,000 pornography addicts or more, you just kind of start to pick up on the, really? But my job is, especially in the beginning, is not to try to do anything that will bring that shame. So there's one of the first struggles, is that when somebody is looking for this magic pill, bullet, or whatever, that alone is something that says, hey, I've tried this before and it hasn't worked. And so they come in and basically I feel like they're interviewing the therapist to say, do you got anything new? Do you got anything different here? And so that's one of the things that I kind of like to say. We don't have a magic pill. We don't have a magic bullet. But we've got a way to figure this out. And it's a strength-based way that starts with getting rid of the shame. So here's where I go into back to that acceptance and commitment therapy model. So if our goal is to, let's just say if the client's goal becomes I'm going to put pornography behind me once and for all, whatever that means to them, but I want to remove this from my life. Then in the world of acceptance and commitment therapy, watch what the brain will do. The brain does this thing called reason giving, which is maybe a nice way to say the brain starts making excuses. So we can say, I'm going to put that behind me, right? And then the brain's going to immediately kind of say, okay, but you've said that before. And so what's the brain trying to do there? It's trying to get you, they call it to hook onto this thought, to hook onto this story, that if you fuse to or you believe this story, then you don't have to do the hard work of saying, I'm going to hang in there, I'm going to do the work, I'm going to put this behind me once and for all. So if your brain immediately says that, you know what, you've said this before, or you are spending a lot of money trying to figure this out, or I don't know, if you open up to this guy, this could be scary. Here's the thing with acceptance and commitment therapy that I love. We're not trying to determine if those stories that your brain's trying to hook you to are true or false. Let's look at those 3 stories your brain tried to hook you to. Number 1, have you tried to do this before and it hasn't worked? You bet. That one's true. Is it a productive thought toward you are now working on this goal to put this behind you? It's not very productive. It's not a workable thought, they say. What was the second one? That paying a lot of money for this. True or false? Sure. And even that's relative, depending on how much money someone has or what they seek. I had a wonderful bishop tell me one time when I had been working with a couple for a while, and the couple had rung up quite a tab that the church was paying for, and even to the point where I was starting to feel a little bit guilty. And this bishop said, hey, we'll pay to have somebody's tooth removed, but what about paying to save somebody's marriage? So sometimes these things are relative as well. So again, true or false story. Is it a lot of money? Maybe. Yes. No. We aren't going to go to a court of law, and we're not going to get out CPAs and accountants and look over your budget and deem, yes, it is a lot of money. Okay. Who cares? Well, is that a workable thought if your goal is to put this behind you once and for all? And I think I've forgotten the third story, if I'm being honest with you. I was going to pretend that I'm just very passionate and moving on from it, and maybe it'll hit me back in a moment. But so that's what I love about doing the work. That's why I feel like acceptance and commitment therapy is such a strong modality in working toward removing this type of addiction. So we've already addressed that there is no magic pill or bullet. We've also addressed that your brain is going to fight hard to take you down the path of least resistance. If you hook or fuse to one of those stories that, man, I have been here before, and it does cost a lot of money, and you just run with that thought, you fuse to that thought, you hook to that thought, then you may find yourself saying, it's not even worth it. I don't even want to try. And look what just happened there. I mean, your brain, bless its heart, is, the book, The Happiness Trap by Russ Harris, says it's a don't get killed device. But not only is it a don't get killed device, but the brain thinks that the best thing it can do is try to run on low power mode. It thinks that the longer it can do that, the longer it's going to live. So it's not very sure about what you're going to be doing if you're going to try to do this hard work of getting rid of this addiction. And so it's going to try to get you down this path of least resistance. And here's the struggle, here's the challenge, is it's also saying, hey, by the way, this path of least resistance also ends in an orgasm that lights up the brain, the reward center of the brain, in the similar fashion as does things like cocaine or those sort of things. And P.S., we've got your own supply in your own head. So the brain's going to fight a little bit hard to try and keep you engaged in this addiction. So there are some of the fundamentals. There are some of the early things that we're kind of looking at. Oftentimes I'll do a little bit of, again, the psychoeducational work. And there's enough data now that does kind of show, again, that this can be harmful. I like to use the phrase it warps one's sexuality. And there's a tremendous amount of data now that shows that there's some pretty fascinating things that come from early exposure to pornography and a lot, and chronic masturbation or whatever we want to call that. And one of those is erectile dysfunction. The highest group of folks with erectile dysfunction these days, I believe the stats show 18 to 25-year-old men. And why? Why is that the case? And it's because people become just conditioned. This is where I kind of go with that. And warped sounds pretty harsh. But the sexuality, when it becomes warped, when they know that they can turn to this willing female on the computer screen that is maybe perfect body and is saying all the right things and noises and whatever, then when they get with a real person, a real woman who maybe is having a good day or a bad day, or the date didn't go as well as it should have, or they're so excited that they don't know what to do with themselves, then they can kind of get in their own head. And then when they are overthinking the concept of trying to be with someone, a lot of times that can lead to that erectile dysfunction. There's other reasons that can lead to that as well. But typically with older people, that's when you're looking at a lot more diet and exercise, that sort of thing. With the younger people, it can be a pretty solid mindset. So, and here's a good time to step back and take a look at that early exposure to pornography. The research there shows it's about 8 to 11 years old. And I think that's even tends to start trending younger. And it's just data. I mean, so that's the part where, if somebody's listening right now and they just pulled off the side of the road with a gasp of horror, I understand. But man, if you have that gasp of horror and that sort of thing in front of someone that maybe is struggling and they're young, hey, welcome to the world of shame. That person's gonna have a harder time opening up to you. So, and I know that's a bit of maybe part of just working in this world as a profession. But so from that point, here's the speech I like to give on sexualization. So when people have been exposed to pornography, now back in the day, we called someone being sexualized. It was typically if there had been something like molestation. So, back in my day, it was there was no internet. The movie channels. If you didn't have the subscription to it, I can't even tell you how many people my age you hear. You're flipping through the channels and you get to the pay channel and it's like fuzzy and it's kind of the lines are going up and down or whatever. And if you sit there and stare at it long enough, you might be able to get a 2 millimeter patch of black and white, was that nudity? That kind of thing. Or somebody in the neighborhood had a magazine. There was someone in my circles that I ran with, and these were very good guys who had got a hold of a magazine, and they actually threw a Scouts Boys Life cover over it. So it appeared like we were very interested in scouting if that magazine was ever brought out. But so that was, in the grand scheme of things, what we look at now was fairly tame. So now when someone is exposed to pornography early, and especially when they're the graphic images, the videos, that sort of thing, now we know that early exposure to pornography kind of equates to sexualization. So now what I like to say is that if that age of first exposure is 9, 10 years old, what grade are they in? Is that like a third, fourth grade? So now that person, little Timmy sitting there in class, he's seen videos. It's typically and I'm apologize when I try to make light of this, but I deal with it so often. Typically that first exposure happens at, quote, a cousin's house, and they've seen some video, something like that, and then it does that kind of excitement, the adrenaline, the heart rate races, they kind of get those feel-good chemicals going, even if they're prepubescent. There's still this excitement, and whether it's the feeling of that I shouldn't be seeing that or whatever it is, it does stir excitement. And the bigger challenge, I was going to say problem or issue, but those are dramatic words, is now what that sexualization means is now little Timmy's sitting in class, and if his teacher is there, and I remember this. I remember the guy who was sitting beside me one time. I think it was the teacher was a lady named Mrs. Anderson, and we were about in that age. And now I look back on it, and this person had definitely been exposed to pornography. I don't know about anything else in their life. But he had said, man, look at Mrs. Anderson's chest. That's what he was basically saying. I can still, I don't know, why do we have some of those memories that we do? I remember, sure, look at it. But she was wearing a shirt, that sort of thing. She was a little bit overweight. And I just remember thinking, I just thought he was saying that she was a little bit overweight. And I was like, I know, right? Isn't that funny? And he didn't respond with, hey, that was funny. So, so when someone's been exposed early, again, whether it's that viewing of pornography or if it is a sexual, sexual abuse, that sort of thing, now they see the world kind of through a different lens. Now Mrs. Anderson isn't just Mrs. Anderson, the annoying third grade teacher, but she has curves and those sort of things. And so, and if you kind of think about, there's a talk I love by a guy named Dieter Uchtdorf, and he talks about where if you're on a plane and you kind of start off when you're 1 degree off course, that over the course of hours of flight, look how far away you are from your destination. And sometimes I like to think in terms of that sexualization kind of starts that person off course. So depending on where that sexualization occurred, how young that was, and to what severity or extent, now you can see that the plane kind of starts to head off course at that point. So sometimes when we're addressing it and when they're in their 20s or 30s or that sort of thing, their sexuality can be pretty far off course. Now, also here enters the Coolidge effect. And I should know this story in and out. I used to talk about it all the time. I've got a podcast episode on the Coolidge effect. But what the Coolidge effect said, it had something to do with President Coolidge and his wife were touring, I believe as the story goes, a farm that had chickens or something like that. They walked the president by this rooster, and they gave him the facts that this rooster mated however many times a day, and so then I think he said something. The story goes that he said something to the helper, hey, make sure you tell that to, he says, make sure you tell that to Mrs. Coolidge. Mrs. Coolidge comes by later in the tour and is given that information that this rooster can mate several times a day. And so, no, you know what, it might be backwards. I should have done the research before. But in essence, it was like, one female, no. So I think it was backwards. No, sir, multiple females. Okay, tell that to Mrs. Coolidge or something like that. But the point being that what the Coolidge effect is, and it's been observed in a number of animals is it started with rats. So you put a rat in a cage and you give him a willing female, he will mate with her, then he will not mate with her again. You put another willing female in the cage, he will mate with her, then he will not mate with either of the two again. A third, and so on, until basically he will mate with them to death. I don't know if he runs out of little mouse bodily fluids or he has a heart attack or whatever it is. But so that's the Coolidge effect. Now, how does that come into place with pornography? That kind of speaks to this fact that, if we kind of go back in time, our brains were designed and we were anticipating finding the one true love, the one woman. So when we would see this woman, our brain would go crazy and pouring out dopamine saying, you've got to get her, And so then when we would get her, then we would mate and live happily ever after. The problem is that pornography is starting to, game that whole system. So what the brain does is it pours out a bunch of dopamine when it sees on the screen this willing female. But here comes another willing female with the next click and another willing female. And so each time the brain's like, oh my gosh, more dopamine, more dopamine. So you're blasting these dopamine neuroreceptors and just frying them. And so with the dopamine receptors blasted, then the next time it's like, okay, I need more. I need something more. And so over time, what the Coolidge effect kind of leads to is that people start to amp up what they are watching. They need more. They need things to be more, and they can be more twisted or more violent or more, and so that's what kind of sets people down this path of warping their sexuality. So by the time that they get with a real partner, they aren't necessarily just, looking at the things they looked at as a child, where it might have just been a naked girl or whatever. Now it's they need this whatever this thing is that will provide them enough of the dopamine rush. So that really can be one of the big challenges. So that's the Coolidge effect. So once we kind of have this world of psychoeducational data to work with, then I like to start working on, all right, what are we going to do now? So one of the things I really like to talk about is this habit cycle. And in my program, The Path Back, this is something that we talk about all of these things. But so the habit cycle really just simplistically says there's a trigger, then you have a thought, and then you have an action. So, and the triggers in olden days, all we'd try to do was get rid of the triggers, trigger. But the hard part is the more we kind of realize that what this sexual addiction is, or what this addiction looks like, is that the triggers aren't just, keep him out of the gym, don't let him see cleavage. The triggers are, I call them, one of the main ones I call it crime of opportunity. It's boredom or it's opportunity. So a good example of this is somebody that they would take their kids to school, their wife would go to work, they had about a 2-hour window before they had to go to work, and so crime of opportunity. They pull back up to the house, and the brain, with that trigger, here comes the thought. The thought is, I could totally act out, and then here comes the action of the person kind of starting to act out. So in the long game, what we're trying to do is, if we can eliminate triggers, great, So in that scenario, that guy, he just started going to work early. I think he started going where he went somewhere where he would do some reading or study, or even maybe in the parking lot of his office, started doing some mindfulness or meditation, that sort of daily scripture study, that sort of thing. But so really eliminating that trigger was a very positive thing. But we can't always be in a spot where we can eliminate triggers. So where the real work becomes is putting distance between that thought and action. So and I'll tell you, spoiler alert, the most evidence-based way to put that distance between thought and action is this concept of mindfulness. You hear about it a lot. Now, how does mindfulness work in that situation? Let me take a step back. Let me take 2 steps back. So while we're going to start working on this mindfulness component, meanwhile, the mindfulness thing takes a little while. A lot of people don't buy into it. It does take a little while to train the brain. And again, I'll explain that here in a second. But so the first thing that we have to do is put some behavioral techniques in, some behavioral mechanisms in. There are programs that say whenever you have that, that there's that trigger and there's that thought. There's one that I love for youth where it says run out and touch a mailbox. Well, it's not about touching the mailbox. It's a behavioral pattern that is trying to break up that trigger, thought, action routine. So I have people that they literally get down and do push-ups. They go on walks around the block. When I have people in my Path Back program working on this relapse prevention program, you are identifying a list of things that you can do. But here's the problem. Those things that you can do, there are going to be times where you maybe don't have access to the things. You are confined. And that's the whole point, where all along the way, in a perfect world, we get rid of the triggers. In a perfect world, we can go do some behavioral thing, and then we feel the success. But where the most evidence-based modalities around changing your relationship with your thoughts of pornography, being able to step back and saying, okay, I just recognize the trigger. Here's a thought, and being able to step back and say, okay, I see what you're doing there, brain. You're trying to lure me down that path. You're trying to tell me that story of this is inevitable. You're going to do it anyway. You might as well do this. And so here's where the mindfulness component comes in. The hard part is when somebody starts to work with me, and I try to get them to just start to embrace a mindfulness practice. I'm a huge fan of this app called Headspace. I know there's one called Calm that I've tried as well that's really good. But here's what happens with mindfulness. So when somebody is starting to get into this habit cycle, when there's that trigger there, and then they have that thought, their heart rate's starting to elevate. They're starting to kind of just go into this autopilot. They're starting to get this excitement. They're starting to kind of go into this mode where they're heading toward acting out. So the mindfulness component, when you're doing a daily mindfulness practice, the first thing it does is it literally does have you sit up straight, back against the chair, and it really is like in through the nose, out through the mouth breathing. I used to think that wasn't very important, or I would tell people, make sure you take some breaths, but I didn't get the science behind it. Because what you're doing is when you're doing that in through the nose, out through the mouth breath, you are lowering your heart rate. And if you can lower your heart rate, you're signaling to your brain, hey, I think we're good. I don't think we need to amp up. I don't think we need to get the adrenaline going. I think we got this. But a daily mindfulness practice, the one Headspace that I love, is you kind of do that breathing. You get yourself kind of nice and calm. You do a little bit of a body scan. It's got you thinking about your back against the chair, your butt on the seat, your feet on the ground. And all that's doing is while you're focusing on those things, you're not thinking about acting out. You're not thinking about something else. So sometimes over time, that just turning to the breath, doing the body scan, those are going to be enough to get you out of your head of thinking about that acting out. Over time, there's some cool science that says about 8 minutes a day for 8 weeks of mindfulness practice start to kind of reroute the neural pathways of the brain. So it literally does become something that becomes almost just instinctive. When you get triggered and you have that thought, over time, and this is the part that I wish I could just impress on somebody that they would believe early on why this mindfulness practice is so key. But when they turn to that breath, when they do kind of just get themselves centered or grounded or present, over a few weeks of time of doing this, the brain goes, this guy's no fun. I know what he's doing with this. He's not going to let us do anything fun. And so it just kind of, it taps out. It's like, all right, well, let's go ahead and do the thing that he wants to do, then focus on his work or his kids or something like that. So the daily mindfulness practice becomes imperative because, even if it isn't something that we turn to in the beginning, if we have to do those behavioral things, we're going to get to that point in the end. And here's the fun part. Let's go back to that world of acceptance and commitment therapy. How many of those stories is the brain telling as you're hearing this? That stuff's lame. That's for hippies. I don't want to grow a ponytail. No offense to people with ponytails, but that I shouldn't have to do that, or I don't have to go that far, because your brain's trying to hook or fuse you to these stories so that you don't have to do the work. And I understand that. Then I go back to my role as therapist. Somebody doesn't do the mindfulness. They come in, I acted out again. I haven't done the mindfulness yet. I'm just grateful they're being honest, because that is one of the keys to overcoming this addiction. This addiction is just ripe with dishonesty. And people that are, telling someone, no, I'm doing good. I'm doing great. Where then inside they're going, crap, I messed up again, but I can't tell that person because I'm going to let them down. And here comes that shame. And so, which just feeds the addiction cycle. So I like when somebody's coming in, and I like if they're telling me that they're doing all the work and stuff, but I like when they come in and say, I haven't done the mindfulness. I haven't really done any, read much of the stuff you're doing. I'm not trying to get my diet in order or my health. And I almost feel like that's that story of, so now what are you going to do, Mr. Therapist? Can you go ahead and tell me I'm broken so I can go ahead and leave and like I've done with other therapists or other programs and go back to relapse and that sort of thing? And I'm sorry, that's what I love about acceptance and commitment therapy. Not going to work that way. It's like, okay, I see what your brain's trying to do. Your brain's trying to hook you to the, see, I'm broken story. Yeah, it doesn't work in my dojo. Thanks for that data. And now with that data, what do we do? What's beautiful about acceptance and commitment therapy is if you haven't done the mindfulness in 2 weeks, guess what? When you finally remember that, your brain's going to blast you with the, look, dummy, you're not even doing the work. And over time, you're able to, they call it self as context in the world of acceptance and commitment therapy. You're able to step back from yourself, get context there and go, aha, now I see that's happening. My brain's trying to fuse me to this I'm broken story, or I'll never get this story. And guess what? Not productive thoughts. They're just not productive thoughts. Normal, you bet, but not productive thoughts. And part of this entire process, just like with that mindfulness and training the brain, is learning how to recognize those patterns of behavior or patterns of thought that got us right back into the addiction. So that's some of the kind of really fascinating stuff. And a quick note on acceptance and commitment therapy, and I've said this on a few podcasts as well. Another thing I love about it is if you're really doing some good acceptance and commitment therapy work, maybe with a good therapist in that area, you're going to go over your values. And let me just tell you why this is important. we all have different values. It goes back to that because of that we are the only person who is brought up and has the experiences that we have. So what a lot of people do is they set goals that are based on someone else's values or values that they think that they're supposed to have. I'll give you an example that comes up a lot when people are doing things like scripture study. If they want that to be a part of their lives, they might say, I need to sit down and read my Bible for 15 minutes a day. But if their core values are around, I don't know, adventure, excitement, learning, those sort of things, then just linearly reading scripture that doesn't speak to them then isn't necessarily as fulfilling. And so then when they get to the end of that 15 minutes, if they get to the end of that 15 minutes and they feel like that didn't work, or then they get to go back to that what's wrong with me story. And we're going to get rid of the what's wrong with me story because guess what? You're you. Nothing's wrong. We're just trying to figure things out. So in acceptance and commitment therapy, and this is a very true story because it is my story, I was that guy that was trying to all right, I know I need to read my scriptures every day, but my ADD would go all over the place. I wasn't raised in a religious, I used to make all these excuses. That's because I didn't really have this as a kid or whatever it was. But no, the way my brain works, the things that matter, my personal values are more around this just learning and growth and adventure and being authentic. And so I remember the first time I'm reading some New Testament stuff and I think, those are, what were they wearing? Were they barefoot? You hear about Jesus sandals, people talk about that. What were those? So all of a sudden I'm Googling, what do they wear back in the day? What were the roads like? That sort of thing. And then all of a sudden, instead of 15 minutes of something that then I feel like I failed at or I didn't get anything from, I did 30 minutes of just, going on these, just learning more about the people of the time, which then actually shockingly made me want to go back and, all right, now I'm going to read that same passage with the context. And it just kind of came alive. It really was something different or important to me. So even when we're setting goals around the recovery, we're doing them based on your values. What's important to you? Another example I've given on other podcasts is just, you have to do this as an individual as well. Because if you're sitting in a room with your spouse, or let's say it's even with a church leader or a parent, and you get to this, the value of honesty. So I will tell this, I once had a client who had two, I would say fairly narcissistic parents who just spun every story in who knows what way, and the person just didn't even know what to say. So to him, honesty was a value. Honesty was to be had above all. But I have had another client who grew up where the family just barked out what he called brutal honesty, and it did not go well. Yeah, you do look fat. I hate that food, whatever. And so he's like, I'm sorry, but to me, honesty means something different. Welcome to the world of private experiences. So that word honesty is going to hold, it's a different value for different people based on the situations that they've had in their lives. So part of this is we're doing this habit cycle is we're trying to put distance between thought and action. There's this mindfulness component, there's these goals that we set, but it is key to know that part of this entire journey of putting this addiction behind you once and for all is recognizing here comes a cliche, but it's learning how to have this just life that you want, that you never felt you could have, and that life includes understanding your values and setting goals based on your values. I believe that if a goal is not based on your value, then it just becomes a rule that you are inevitably not going to keep, and then you get to go back to that what's wrong with me story. When the brain hears the what's wrong with me story, it just says, we've got this. We know what to do. Let's go give him a quick hit of dopamine. Sure, he'll have a little bit of shame, but at least we're going to kind of get him out of this feelings of negativity. When somebody is living an authentic life, and this is where I go back to that, I feel like addiction at its core is about a void. So you've got the sexualization early. That's the data that we're working with. But then that sexualization or this addiction can lead to isolation and people feeling shame and the what's wrong with me story. And then they don't feel as connected to their spouse if they're married. Maybe they're in a job that they don't care about. Maybe they don't feel like they're a good parent. Maybe they aren't very comfortable or have questions about their faith. Maybe they don't have the health that they always wanted. And so all of those things play into this void. So I can do the behavioral things. Go touch the mailbox. Do the push-ups. We're going to start working on the mindfulness component so that you can start to realize, I see what you're doing, brain. You're trying to hook me to this, I got to act out now, or I'm going to do it later anyway story. Or this is the last time story, or whatever that is. So I get that. But then if you are then working toward being authentic in all of these other areas, there's a lot of things that happen there. Number one, when you're feeling authentic in your marriage, you want to be in your marriage more. When you feel like you know what you're doing as a parent, you're ready to go play catch or hang out with the kids more. When you are working toward your dream job or even are working your values into your current job, your job looks different. If you're looking at, back to the acceptance commitment therapy thing, let's go to the one with health. Hey, I could talk about I ran 12, 13, 100-mile races. I can give a nice motivational speech where somebody in the crowd's going to be like, I'm doing it. I'm going to do that too. And then immediately the brain goes, you don't even have any shoes. You don't have a training program. All the races are far away. And your brain goes nuts trying to get you to fuse to one of those stories, so you don't actually have to start looking into what it would take to, ramp up the running ultramarathons and 100-mile races and that sort of thing. So I only say that because the brain's just trying to just chill, as the kids say. It's trying to keep you locked into where you're at right now. So where are we at now? In summary, trying to become more authentic. So if you are just all about you're trying to figure out what's right for you health wise, exercise wise. If you're feeling like, okay, I'm going to go get marriage therapy, I'm going to figure out how to be a better husband. If my relationship isn't good, then doggone it, let's fix this thing. And start watching what those stories the brain's going to tell, and recognizing that I don't have to hook to one of those stories because I want this change. Or, working your values into your job. I've got super cool examples of that. One of the most simplistic, basic ones. So I'm not talking about corporate CEOs, although I've worked with those too, but it was just a kid that was working at McDonald's, and he didn't like he's working on the grill, and he's miserable. And then we do the values exercise, and we, one of his is like, I think it was self-improvement. Maybe that was one of his core values. And so then he decided, all right, you know what? During my breaks, I'm going to ask the manager how you do whatever, the fries. I'm going to ask him how to do the drink machine. I'm going to ask him. And so he did that. So then he felt more, sure, he spent a lot of time still on the grill, but then he felt like he was learning more, the self-development, and honestly worked his way up within a summer, and he was making a couple bucks more an hour and just found fulfillment, and people were telling him, you're the man. There was so much good about that, of him living his value. And so you can work your values even into a job that you don't necessarily care about. Or, man, I can do a story someday on, I was 10 years in software. It provided fine financially, but it wasn't really scratching that itch, that value-based itch. So we put all those pieces together. We're aware of the sexualization. We kind of have all that awareness. We're putting the mindfulness component in. We're letting the person know that you're not a horrible person. This is something that happens. Sometimes there's this world called narrative therapy where you're the good person, but then here comes this cloud of whatever, pornography, negativity that descends upon you when you aren't, doing this self-care things, when you aren't being as authentic, those sort of things. So we're going to get you back to you being a good person. Will relapse happen? There are times that I work with people that they don't. I'll be honest. It's pretty rare, but there are times. But so if it happens, then we just got data to work with. We're not going to fuse to the holy cow, what happened story. It's going to be like, there's data. I see where my mind was going. I see what my mind hooked to. We're going to work on things like avoiding what they call benders, avoiding just immediately turning back to the addiction, saying, well, this day's over, might as well act out a whole bunch, or this weekend's over, because those are just those lies or stories the brain tells you. So, you start getting a world of, you get somebody with 2 or 3 weeks where they haven't acted out, then they have one slip up, they get out of there quick, then they go back to, 4 weeks of not acting out. And all of a sudden now you got 7 weeks, you got one mess up. Sorry, I hit the microphone there. And that's something we can build on. That's a strength-based thing. I think I'm going to call this part 1, and we're going to see if this even works and try to put this episode together. But part 2, we'll kind of talk a little bit more about kind of the long-term recovery. We'll talk about things like harm reduction. And if you have any questions, if this one does hit the light of day, shoot them over to me at contact@tonyoverbay.com. Hey, thanks for taking a few moments here. There's a couple of things on this program that I'm testing. One of them I think says an outro or whatever, and so you might hear me come back on and say thanks again. But thanks for spending the time. People really, really can put this behind them once and for all, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts, your comments, questions, that sort of thing. Okay, so the program I'm working with, this is the closer portion. I think I'm going to skip the outro, so I should have maybe thought this thing through a little more logically. But for the closer, thanks for joining me today. I have to tell you a real quick experience there. I recorded, and I think it's 30, 40 minutes of recording there that I just did. And then it was just saying that it was uploading the file for quite a while, and I started to panic, thinking, oh my gosh, I didn't do a backup. What did I even just say? But so it looks like all is well. So this is the closer. Thanks for joining me today on the virtual couch. I do look forward to, I'm going to put out a episode, a second part to this. Maybe we'll do that in a week or so. And please send questions, even with what you've heard now, or questions that you've had about pornography addiction, compulsive sexual behavior, all those sort of things, because I realize there's a lot of stuff I probably didn't get to because I was just trying to go off the cuff. But send those questions to contact@tonyoverbay.com. And if you have a second, stop by tonyoverbay.com and just sign up there to hear more about some things that are coming up. There's a lot of really cool stuff coming up. And also, follow me on Instagram at Virtual Couch, or on Facebook at Virtual Couch. There's a Facebook page, or Tony Overbay, licensed marriage and family therapist. And if you have a moment, I would just be forever in your debt to rate and review and subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. That's kind of the currency of podcasts these days, as the ratings and the subscriptions and that sort of thing. So I honestly, from the bottom of my heart, appreciate that if you haven't done that and you have a second to do so. But until next time, I'll talk to you again on the Virtual Couch.